फिलहाल सिर्फ एक वैक्सीन जो है जिसको अप्रूव किया गया है, वो भी एक पर्टिकुलर टाइप ऑफ कैंसर जो इंडिया में कुछ हद तक कॉमन है, यहाँ उतनी कॉमन नहीं है.
HPV?
It's exactly. It's the HPV vaccine for cervical cancer.
Correct. अच्छा.
Yeah. So that does prevent a certain type of cancer, which happens in the cervix and which is much more common in India than in the United States. Relatively speaking. So, but बाकी किसी भी कैंसर के लिए अभी तक clinical trials are always going on. But so far nothing has succeeded where it's out and available.
नहीं डॉक्टर साहब, लेकिन जो वायरस जो निकला अभी कोविड वाला, they use this messenger RNA.
Yes.
So it's not real dead virus नहीं थी वो. तो इसी तरह से messenger RNA can they apply towards other ailments cancer के?
I have to say I'm not familiar with it, but what I do know is that messenger RNA की जो टेक्नोलॉजी है ये बिल्कुल नई है.
Exactly.
और ये पहली बार सबसे पहले फाइजर ने कोविड वैक्सीन बनाने में इस्तेमाल किया है इसको. तो इसका इस्तेमाल कैंसर में तो हुआ ही नहीं है पहले, तो इसीलिए अब कैंसर में वो कहां तक पहुंचे इसका मुझे अंदाजा नहीं है. As far as I know, there is no messenger RNA vaccine, nothing that is viable at this point. But I'm sure they have tried in an infectious disease like COVID. Maybe at some point they'll try in a oncology situation as well. पर आज की तारीख में कुछ नहीं है.
कुछ नहीं. अच्छा, ये जो HPV जो बोल रहे हैं डॉक्टर साहब, HPV जो वायरस होती है, ह्यूमन पैपिलोमा वायरस जो बोलते हैं, it's a normal inhabitant of the cancer cervix.
Well, it's considered to be a sexually transmitted disease. So, HPV is very common, but it is transmitted sexually. So, HPV is generally more common in, somebody who may have, now I don't want to say exclusively so, but generally more common in people who have started having let's say sexual activity from an earlier age or have multiple partners, but nobody is completely immune. So, but it's basically a sexually transmitted disease. This is HPV.
But कहीं ना कहीं तो होनी चाहिए convey करने के लिए, the person who gets infected first has to have virus from some place, right?
But I mean, HPV is so common that to try to prevent it that way is almost impossible. It's not like AIDS or anything because it's very easily transmissible. So that's why the protection against HPV, if we think on those lines, to use protection for sexual barriers or whatever, that's not likely to slow it. That is not very likely. So the way is the vaccine. So if you had the vaccine, and for a woman, for example, it is advised that a woman get that vaccine before a certain age, before she decides to become sexually active. So usually it is best given at a young age.
Preventive.
Best given at a young age before that person becomes sexually active, because the idea is that once they become sexually active, they probably have HPV already. And at that point, the vaccine may not do the trick.
Right, but HPV जो होता है डॉक्टर साहब, उसका source कहाँ से होता है? Animal to humans, humans to humans. The virus should be existing somewhere, right?
Well, it's human to human.
Right.
It's not from animals or anything else. It's a human to human. It can also happen in the mouth. And it's more common, different sexual practices. So HPV can affect mouth also, inside the oral cavity. And some cancers of the tonsil have also been related to HPV. But the more common type of cancer that is related to HPV is cervical cancer. That's the most common.
But
so, there are...
In other words, if a person has, that means the men can also get HPV in the genitalia?
Yes. Absolutely. So certain anal cancers could be HPV related.
Okay.
of the anal tract, just like the cervical. Not all most anal cancers are not due to HPV, but
Acha.
some of them could be due to HPV.
Okay,
And
okay.
in the mouth,
Mm-hmm.
which as a whole, we refer to it as the head and neck cancers.
Correct.
So head and neck cancers, some of them, they're more, especially in India and even in other parts of the world, the most common cause is tobacco and alcohol. But a subgroup of people may have HPV related head and neck cancer. And the most commonly it happens in the tonsil and the oropharynx.
Fair.
So,
Acha.
yeah.
So,
And, uh-huh.
like in the source जो है to come to the oral, it has to metastasis or what?
And no, basically, it's also supposedly through sexual, yeah,
Okay, okay.
yeah,
Ha, ha,
yeah.
ha.
It could be sexually transmitted.
Acha.
But that's what, as far as we know, that they're sexually transmitted, whether it's in the mouth, whether it's in the anal canal, whether it's in the cervix.
Cervix. अच्छा लेकिन ये जो herpes zoster है herpes labialis है those things are in mouth में होते हैं zoster वगैरह होता है right virus in the mouth
Yeah,
also
so
that's not
that's a different virus. That's
okay
the herpes zoster it's a herpes family,
okay
whereas HPV is human papilloma virus.
virus अच्छा two different
Yeah, yeah,
distinctively अच्छा अच्छा
exactly.
okay so that's why they women usually doctors advise करते हैं कि pap smear करने इसके लिए तो करते हैं check करने के लिए pap smear जो
हाँ
होता है
वो पैप स्मीयर करते हैं चेक करने के लिए. The whole idea is that all of these screening tests are, the idea is to pick up the cancer at an early stage
early
so
stage
you can nip it in the bud.
so in other words वो जो HP वायरस जो होता है cancer it's diagnosed at a later stage if woman doesn't go through regular screening.
No, so the test that they are doing for cervical cancer screening, that's not necessarily testing for HPV because
अच्छा
HPV is extremely common. They're looking for the cellular changes in the cervix.
हाँ 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 हाँ
They're not trying to pick up HPV when they're doing pap smear.
okay
They're
okay
trying to see, are there, because you see, even though HPV is very common, only a fraction of women with HPV will have cervical cancer. Most wouldn't actually.
अच्छा
Most women with HPV will not have cervical cancer. Only a small number will have.
so but it's common inhabitant.
Yes, exactly. But the HPV virus itself is extremely common. Cervical cancer, thankfully, is not that common. But but because it can be prevented by this vaccine, so that's why it's recommended. Ideally, a woman should get it before she becomes sexually active. Now, if for some reason they couldn't, well, then they can get it at a later age also.
जी 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 अरे अरे दोस्तों if you have any question Dr. Nahar is an oncologist here if you have any interest I mean a question to ask about the cancer and how to prevent so as far as this HPV virus is concerned any other part of the body also can be affected besides mouth and the anus and the anal canal and the
No, not to my knowledge. Again, it's more for the infectious disease specialist to know. Because remember, for me as an oncologist,
जी
I am only kind of have the knowledge of the virus where it's relevant to oncology.
अच्छा
But if as far as I know, I am not aware of HPV affecting other parts of the body. But it's I'm not sure.
okay and HP virus जो cancer होता है तो it's a very mild होता है या it's very fatal होता है usually if it's not treated.
So the HPV virus cancer, interestingly, when it happens in the oropharynx or the tonsil, it generally has a better prognosis
अच्छा
compared to the same type of cancer that's due to smoking or alcohol. So if somebody gets a smoking-related head and neck cancer,
right
that generally has a worse prognosis, stage for stage, of course, than HPV related. Now, when it comes to the cervix and the anal canal, that's not very clear. It depends not so much whether the HPV caused it or not, but depends on the stage in which it was detected. If it's detected at an early stage, it will have a better prognosis, whether it was caused by HPV or not.
आपसे एक interesting question I want to ask you, Dr. Nahar. It's very general. ये जो आप बोल रहे हैं कि before you get this, you have to screen for HPV virus, right? So suppose there's a kind of united UN से होता है कुछ यूनाइटेड UNO से कि mandate anybody who gets married mandatory they have to go through this test so that at least when couples get married they'll be aware that they are negative, right?
For HPV, as far as I know, it's not going to be helpful. It's not going to be very helpful.
अच्छा.
Because you see, I'm going to again insist, it's so very common.
अच्छा.
So, हाँ, तो अगर जैसे मैं आपको एक एग्जांपल के रूप में बता रहा हूँ.
जी.
Let's say if somebody is going to marry somebody.
जी.
And if they want to make sure that the other person does not have a sexually transmitted disease.
Right.
They can look for things like HIV or gonorrhea, but HPV is not going to be helpful because it's so very common.
Existing.
So, exactly. So to try to not get involved with somebody because that's not going to work because it's so common.
Achha.
So the way is not to, it's not, I don't know, at some point there might be such a thing, but right now the only way to prevent HPV from causing problem is the vaccine. But to try to weed it out by testing somebody for HPV, that's not been found to be very useful.
And then HPV vaccine जो बोल रहे हैं आप, it should be given irrespective of whether you find it or not, blindly, like a vaccine that बचपन में.
Of course, in fact, it should be given before the HPV's effect. That's the best time to give. You see, that's why they recommend that HPV vaccine is ideally given to those women who have not yet become sexually active. So to give them when they are relatively young.
Okay.
So this way, that's the best time to give them the HPV vaccine.
Okay. So in other words, even if we don't give a vaccine, it's not necessary that they will not be having the virus. They could still be having virus.
Say that again. I'm
मेरा
sorry.
कहने का मतलब है कि अब woman है, right now they have to have some screening before they doesn't have to have screening. They can still take HPV vaccine to prevent that.
बिल्कुल हाँ, जब HPV वैक्सीन दिया जाता है किसी लेडी को या औरत को या गर्ल को, तो वो उसमें स्क्रीनिंग वगैरह नहीं करते, उनको बस दे देते हैं. हाँ, उनको वो यंग एज में दे देते हैं.
अच्छा.
और उसमें उम्मीद यही होती है कि शायद अभी ये इनको HPV इनको नहीं हुआ होगा, और अगर हुआ भी है तो कुछ ना कुछ असर करेगा ही वैक्सीन.
जी.
तो आइडियली वो चाहते हैं, इसलिए यंग एज में देना चाहते हैं कि बोले कि इसके पहले कि कोई लेडी सेक्सुअली एक्टिव हो, मतलब HPV चूंकि इतना कॉमन है
जी, तो
बाकी किसी तरीके से उसको प्रिवेंट करना ऑलमोस्ट इम्पॉसिबल है. तो इसीलिए वो जो तरीके हैं, जैसे आप जैसे कहते हैं ना HIV के लिए या गोनोरिया के लिए सिर्फ कि आप ये इस्तेमाल कीजिए वो इस्तेमाल कीजिए, लेकिन HPV में इतना ज्यादा कॉमन है कि उसको उस तरह से प्रिवेंट करना मुश्किल है.
इवन इफ वेयर कॉन्डम्स वेयर करते हैं तो भी नहीं.
हाँ, मतलब I mean, so I have not heard, because it's again more by the infectious disease specialists will know more about that.
Achha.
But we have not heard about any such things are very effective against preventing HPV. So you really cannot prevent HPV in the general population because it's so common. The only way out is the vaccine.
Achha. So men can also take vaccine?
Men can. Now the question is, I am not yet familiar whether this is FDA approved or not. They are just like I told you, cervical cancer